let's have a look at the title. 3 keywords already here: mitigation, adaptation, multifunctional forestry. I don't start with any of them. I start with the resource. So, quick look across Europe. A lot of forests, about 40% land area of the EU 27 covered with forest land. And when we would move through them in reality, or VR, we would find a huge diversity of forest types. Monospecies plantations in, for instance, the Iberian Peninsula, to mixed natural and semi-natural forests in other parts of Europe. Overall, about 85% of that land base is available for wood production, potentially. What we also know from monitoring systems is that over the last decades, area and growing stock has been increasing more or less constantly. Quick shot at the harvested volume per year, it's about between 450, 500 million cubic meter under bark. So just that you have a rough idea what this resource is about. Now, what about the owners? There's a huge diversity of forest owners and stakeholders and society as a whole. And the interests, demands, expectations of these owners, stakeholders, of us towards the forests are of course diverse. This is just kind of an image that should represent the diversity of expectations and demands. And what is important, these demands, these portfolios of interests vary across landscapes in Europe. So this is not a uniform picture. Now, if we have the resource and we have the expectations and the stakeholders, where is now management? So what is a good question maybe before I continue is, does management actually matter when it comes to providing these ecosystem services, these forest products? Well, this is a very simple table. I have selected a few services and products and have had a look into the literature to see whether specific forest attributes are related to a particularly good production of these respective services. And of course, you find then a lot of information. It's obvious: tree species, mixture, special features such as density, minimum, maximum diameter, taper when it comes to wood production, canopy structure, canopy closure, etc., etc., etc. So there obviously is a lot that matters when it comes to ecosystem service provisioning. Now, of course, the follow-up question is, well, what about management? And it is obvious that when we look at this diversity of attributes, that a large number of them will not be provided by natural processes, but will require some kind of management to either generate them or maintain them. So if I continue with the next question, that's the key term of my task today. Well, does it make sense then to manage forests for several ecosystem services, a portfolio, a bundle at small spatial scale? That's then actually multifunctional forestry. And what I'm doing here is I'm using a little bit of theory. Don't be afraid. So theory tells us that if the trade-off relationship between any pair of ecosystem services that we may be interested in looks like this, is concave, then it may be beneficial to manage for several of these services at small scale. Now, this is very easily explained because a small sacrifice in one of these services may result in a fairly high gain in another one. And if you have such a situation, of course, you can then kind of expect a good outcome when you manage multifunctional. This has been proven in several studies. This is just an example that has been published recently from a boreal landscape. So it simply shows that it is possible to design management regimes that actually simply show that behavior with these concave relationships. And overall, the outcome is then that with a multifunctional management approach, the production of ecosystem services is higher compared to a segregation approach. Well, that's theory, and we could continue. What policy actually also does is it provides a nice frame for this kind of management. Forest Europe nowadays, formerly known as the Ministerial Conference for the Protection of Forests in Europe, has produced a frame, a guideline for sustainable forest management. And these pan-European criteria and indicators for SFM that you may know from other sources provides a nice frame, but of course it cannot directly be applied at operational scale, so it needs some work to be done. And what's also a shortcoming at the moment is that explicitly adaptation, resistance, resilience with regard to climate change is actually missing in that frame. So still work to be done. Now, what's going to happen to the forest resource, to demands, expectations from stakeholders to forest management? Definitely, a major driver will be climate change. It is already a major driver and related disturbances. So I don't go into details on these kind of symbolic images. You maybe know better than I that the range of projections regarding temperature is about ranging from +3 to +5.5 in pessimistic scenarios with variation across Europe. This is maybe even stronger in contrast when it comes to precipitation. So you see on this side of the slide that Europe is actually split into a region where we may expect more precipitation in the future and in a region where we may expect less precipitation. This is particularly contrasting in summer. And of course, what is obvious that these changes in climate will be somehow related to what we call disturbance regimes. Forest fire, bark beetle storms, the most prominent in Europe. And a study recently also showed that tree mortality rise in Europe is closely related to drought. So we have the direct link to climate and climatic change. And what then a recent study by colleagues of mine also showed that we may expect a further increase of approximately 1 million cubic meter per year, where the main driver will also be climate change. So what I've brought with me is a small example from Austria. This is a mountain region in the south of Austria, a small mountain valley where over the last 2 to 3 years, more than 2,000 hectares of disturbed forest area have been created by storms, snow breakage, and then continued with bark beetles. Bark beetles have been unknown in that region so far. It's the very first appearance and obviously a clear sign of climate change. This is not just a catastrophe in economic sense for the owners, but a catastrophe for society in general, for local population, because a high share of these forests have priority function of protecting infrastructure, settlements from gravitational hazards, snow avalanches, rockfall, erosion, etc. So this is just a nice indication of how vulnerable key ecosystem services are to climate change and disturbances. This is also proven by several reviews. Here one example, and actually they all agree that most effects of climate change related disturbances on ecosystem services will be negative. There are some exceptions such as biodiversity, where the majority of studies says the opposite, that it may be beneficial for this issue. Climate change, disturbances, obviously clearly driving. What about policies? I've picked a few, starting with the role of forests in mitigation, a very prominent issue. And here the main interest is more or less to pump carbon into forests. So to use the sink function of forests to mitigate climate change. Another prominent, of course, policy issue is to develop, to foster circular bioeconomy as a major means for transforming our economic system into a more sustainable one. And of course, this means that, among others, that we need raw material. So if we now harvest wood and use wood and forest biomass in wood products of more traditional form and also emerging in innovative new products, then this of course also stores temporarily carbon. And with recycling loops and cascading use, in the end we may also use biomass in a very good way to produce energy. And what of course is also very important, the substitution effect of bio-based products against more fossil fuel intense products. So again, a huge mitigation effect which is potentially out there. I could continue with, of course, very strong policy interest in maintaining, improving nature conservation values, biodiversity, ecosystem services in general, and of course also high on the agenda, increasing resistance and resilience of forest ecosystems through adaptation. Just to remind you, every member country in the EU has a national adaptation plan, and forests, of course, usually play a major role in them. So what I had to conclude in preparing this presentation is that obviously there are a lot of policies affecting forests and forest management, but this is a fairly fragmented issue, a picture, and definitely not a coherent decision frame for forestry and forest management. So if I then continue with, again, asking myself a question, what type of forest management should we or could we then apply? Well, simply speaking, it's all about trade-offs. And what I've done here is I simply compare some general management approaches with the policy goals that we have just looked at. And if I start with a very simple, so to say, approach, no management at all, we are setting the forests aside, then it's obvious what the expected outcome will look like. A very strong emphasis of in situ mitigation, so lots of carbon in the forest, but of course, strong limitations on developing bioeconomy and ex situ mitigation measures. Biodiversity and nature conservation will surely benefit from that. Ecosystem services, well, some will benefit and some will be limited with regard to that. But the huge and crucial drawback is that adaptation with active measures will actually be not in place here, which will feed back and may jeopardize the benefits that we have just looked at. So if I continue now quickly with just the opposite approach, we will focus on intensive timber management, then you just have, of course, more or less the vice versa effects, strong benefits for ex situ and bioeconomy, with a bit questionable effects regarding adaptation, because resilience will maybe not be of priority concern when you go for timber, but that's just a reasoning for myself. If I continue with what I've called multifunctional, then this looks very pleasant, I would say. I guess it's not too optimistic. What we should definitely keep in mind is that particularly nature conservation and biodiversity issues needs to be taken seriously as one of the competing interests within that concept. Now what you see is there is still one column kind of open, and I have reserved that for a term that has become quite prominent over the last, I would say, 10 years or so, climate smart forestry. Maybe you have your own image of what climate smart forestry actually means. What it does, it emphasizes strongly mitigation in situ and ex situ and bioeconomy and adaptation, meaning increasing resistance and resilience. Actually, this concept is closely related to multifunctional forestry. It's actually just a variant on that, placing a priori more emphasis on carbon and bioeconomy. So if I also kind of add my quick assessment for climate smart forestry, then you see it's of course then very similar to the one for multifunctional forestry. Yeah, what is definitely an issue is that by placing a lot of emphasis on carbon, you may be aware that other ecosystem services and also biodiversity and nature conservation values should be one of the stakes that are important. Now, coming to my conclusions that I've collected along the way, that's just, again, a repetition to emphasize that from a forest management perspective, the decision framework at the moment is definitely not a clear one. So this needs and calls for improvement. What is also important is that because at the moment, the major source of income for forest owners is actually timber or biomass production, that other incentives and mechanisms to motivate management also for carbon sequestration and other ecosystem services is fostered. For instance, payment for ecosystem services or other mechanisms. What is a crucial issue is that large parts of forests in Europe are owned privately. And among these private owners, a majority are small private owners with just a few hectare forest property size. Most of them are not farmers any longer, but live in cities, so are urban forest owners. And these urban forest owners will definitely need institutional support that any type of forest management will unfold in the future. And finally, beyond using buzzwords like, for instance, also climate-smart forestry, a very sure conclusion is that there is no one-fits-all management approach that you could roll out across Europe. It's a multifunctional approach, and as I have tried to explain in the beginning, this needs to be tailored to local and regional conditions regarding forests, interests, and of course framing conditions. And I guess that's all I have. Thank you very much.